Hey, Eugene. No problem. Is the text going the right direction? Because for me it's backwards and I can't, so it always makes me concerned. It's a combination of OBS, open broadcast software, and a bit of work with images and backgrounds. So I'm just glad it works. You can come on in. We'll see how many questions there are and go from there. I will wait, until we're probably right at 4. I've spent a lot of time making sure I can get this within time, so I'll just go ahead and wait. Since Cecil got a question in before I even started, I will say yes. I think that would make a good movie. I'm always hesitant to say those things because then somebody knows that one exists, because I can't pretend to be an expert on every historical movie. But I don't think one exists, but it could be really fun. In 1914, the world descended into war, a war that would last for over 4 years that we know today as the First World War. It would result in millions of deaths, redraw the map of Europe, and see some of Europe's longest-standing empires destroyed. One of those empires would be the land of the Tsars, Russia. In February 1917, the Russian Empire would experience its first revolution of the year. The new government, led by the socialists, would continue to participate in the war, but then in November, the second revolution of the year would occur. This revolution would bring the Bolsheviks, later known as the Communists, to power, and one of their first challenges was to get Russia out of the war at almost any cost. The full story of these revolutions and the civil war that followed is far beyond the scope of this 20-minute talk, and instead we will focus on one small group of individuals who were caught in the middle, a group that would come to be known as the Czechoslovak Legion. The group of men, women, and children, primarily Czech and Slovak in ethnicity, although others were represented as well, would find itself on the most epic of journeys in early 1918, a journey home and one that would take them all the way around the world. The journey would begin around 750 miles east of the soon-to-be-created Czechoslovakia in Ukraine, but the road west was not an option due to the continued fighting of the First World War. Therefore, they would begin a journey east on the entire length of the Trans-Siberian Railway and through a Russian nation descending into a catastrophic civil war. Their destination was Vladivostok, and from there onto ships across the Pacific, then across North America and the Atlantic, until finally reaching Czechoslovakia from the west. For some, the journey would take over 2 years. During our discussion here today, we're going to try and answer 3 key questions. How did the Czechoslovak Legion find itself stuck in Russia and in the middle of a civil war? Why did they find themselves fighting the Red Army? And what was it like for those who were making the journey? To understand why the Czech Legion found itself in Russia in early 1918, we have to first discuss a little bit about the Austro-Hungarian Empire. Austria-Hungary had been a fixture of Central Europe for centuries, and within the larger empire, there were many different ethnic groups that had started to strongly advocate for, at the very least, greater autonomy and preferably full independence. The Czechs and the Slovaks were 2 of those groups. But their growing nationalism would be kind of put on pause by the First World War. During the war, the Austro-Hungarian Empire would conscript men from all different groups within the empire, and they would fight on all fronts. Thousands of those men, who strongly supported independence, were then captured by the Russian army during the fighting that occurred on the Eastern Front of the First World War. When prisoners were captured by the Russians, there was a general recognition that there were groups within the army that were more or less likely to be strong supporters of the Austro-Hungarian war effort. And because of this, the different ethnicities were generally separated after making the rail journeys to sorting areas in places like Kiev and Moscow. After being separated, some groups, the Austrians, the Hungarians, the Germans, would be sent on their way to Siberia. However, other groups were kept in Western Europe or Eastern Europe and generally sent to labor camps. It was in these camps that they would either become radicalized or would have their beliefs sharpened towards a full break of their lands out of the Austro-Hungarian Empire. For many, this would cause mild feelings of nationalism to turn into actively assisting the Russian cause. And by active, I mean fighting at the front. The idea of using Austro-Hungarian prisoners of war in a volunteer unit for the Russian army dated back to 1916. At that time, Major Stefanik, a Czech officer, was sent to Russia from France. Stefanik, a soldier who'd been fighting Austria-Hungary for years, arrived with the goal of organizing Czech prisoners in Russia into this volunteer unit. There was some initial hesitancy from the Russian government, and at first they would only allow these prisoners to volunteer for work in war industries. These efforts were viewed and messaged to the prisoners as a way of helping to create the future independent nation that they had been hoping for. It would not be until June 1917, and after the replacement of the Tsar, that the next step would be taken by the provisional government, and prisoners were allowed to volunteer for service at the front. They would join the Druzina, a pre-existing unit within the army that had been created in 1914 and was made up of men who had recently migrated out of the Austro-Hungarian Empire and were Czech, Slovak, or some other minority. This unit was fighting for the same thing that the prisoners wanted to fight for, a Russian victory, and the understanding that such a victory would result in a drastic reshaping of the map of Eastern Europe and the creation of an independent nation for the Czechs and the Slovaks. After the prisoners were allowed to join the Druzina by the Provisional Russian government in the summer of 1917, the Czech Legion was in existence, if not yet named as such. The Druzina fought well for the remainder of the Russian war effort, including during the summer 1917 offensives. However, when the Bolsheviks took power, one of their primary goals was to exit the war, and this created the situation in which the Czech Legion would begin its journey east due to the specific plans of three different groups. First, the Legion themselves. Many had joined the Russian war effort to beat Austria-Hungary and then to see their new nations created. If Russia was exiting the war, they were willing to continue that fight, but it would have to be somewhere else. Then France and Britain were more than happy to make that somewhere else the Western Front. France particularly was at the end of its manpower pool, and having the possibility of upwards of 50,000 trained and motivated soldiers to add to the ranks of the French army seemed very appealing. The third group were the Bolshevik leaders. Now their viewpoints would decisively change on this matter during 1918, but at least in the early months of the year, they just wanted the Legion out. It was a time of great confusion in Russia as the Bolsheviks tried to assert their control against groups that were already springing up and that would eventually make up the whites in the Russian Civil War. The Legion was a wild card, and the theory among Bolshevik leaders is that it would be better for them to simply evacuate as quickly as possible. All three of these groups would come to an agreement where the Legion, at the time in Ukraine, would start moving east, first on foot and then by rail. While this agreement was made between the Bolshevik leaders and the leaders of the Legion, as well as the Western powers to provide transport, there were almost instantly problems. Ukraine would be one of the primary battlefields of the Civil War, and even at this early stage, local Bolshevik groups, who were often poorly organized and equipped, saw in the Legion an opportunity. They wanted to extract a toll on the Legion in the form of the weapons that they carried, or as one message to the Legion would say, "We will accept as a token of friendship the arms that the Czechoslovaks were leaving." Now, there was serious hesitation to surrender their weapons to the Bolsheviks, no matter how much they promised that they would let them go afterwards. But at this time, with German and Austrian troops already moving into Ukraine, the Legion just wanted out, so they gave up some weapons, not as many as requested, but some weapons, and they were on their way. A critical point in the journey out of Ukraine would come at the Bakhmut rail depot. This rail center, around 100-ish miles northeast of Kiev, was a critical convergence of some rail lines that would take the Legion east. There was a problem, though. The Germans and Austrians were also approaching the area, and if they got there first, it was likely that the Legion would have to fight its way out. This was a serious concern for some of the last groups of the Legion to exit Ukraine. The situation within Bakhmut was confusing, and they were concerned that they would have to fight their way into the city through German and Austrian troops. What they found is that some of the legionnaires from the previous groups had stayed behind to maintain control of the city while waiting for the last groups. However, they were at that very moment starting to skirmish with German troops who were moving into the city. With the help of the new arrivals, they were able to successfully defend the railway station long enough for troops to begin boarding. They apparently took every rail car in the depot, with some men on the roofs and hanging on the sides of cars as they left the station. In retrospect, Bakhmut would be an important turning point for the Legion's journey. Up until that point, most of the movement had been on foot, and this had resulted in there being many different groups who were all converging on Bakhmut in a somewhat disorganized manner. After they were on the rails, though, a certain amount of discipline and organization returned, or as one of their number, Joseph Sinkel, would say, quote, "The discipline, so lax during the difficult retreat, had quickly and automatically strengthened. Everyone felt it was necessary to pull together if we were going to make it out of this bloody chaos." The events at Bakhmut would just be the first of several important alterations to the situation in which the Legion found itself that all centered around rail stations on their journey east. The next would come at Penza, about 500 miles to the east. This was the point where, again, some rail lines came together, and then they would head off east across Siberia. In Penza, the Legion experienced once again problems with local Bolshevik commanders. They wanted to requisition arms and munitions from the Legion, as well as to try and recruit as many men into the Red Army as possible. This was a point of confusion in Russia, and even small numbers of well-trained and organized troops could make a difference in the Russian Civil War far in excess of their numbers. To accomplish these goals, the Bolshevik authorities in Penza decided to restrict the number of Legion-carrying trains that would be allowed to depart each day, in the hopes that this would weaken the ability to resist Bolshevik threats, both in Penza and then at later stages of the journey. Only a train or two was allowed through, when capacity was far in excess of that, and that's a daily capacity. This caused the Legion's trains to be spread out over eventually the entire length of the Trans-Siberian Railway. This makes our story here today a bit more confusing, unfortunately, because as groups of the Legion were moving through the Lake Baikal region, which is thousands of miles to the east, there were still thousands of troops stuck in Penza. This meant that as events developed over the next several months, there were little pockets of Legion troops all along the journey, all experiencing those events differently based on where they were when they occurred. None of those events would be more impactful than the events at the Chelyabinsk depot. It was at Chelyabinsk, about 700 miles to the east of Penza, that the friction between the Bolsheviks and the Legion would come to a head. At the depot, a Legion train found itself side by side with a train carrying Austro-Hungarian prisoners of war west on their journey home. The two groups were certainly not on the best of terms with one another, and there were taunts thrown back and forth. And then one of the Legion members was injured by something thrown through the window, and very quickly the situation got totally and completely out of control. Both trains emptied, and what started as a brawl resulted in the local Bolshevik militia being called in to make arrests of several Legion officers. When news filtered back to the Legion trains that those officers were then scheduled to be executed, the Legion basically took over the city. The local militia made the very wise decision not to continue to resist, and the Legion trains very rapidly started back on their way east. Now, from a damage perspective, that story doesn't seem like a huge deal. There weren't a ton of casualties, there weren't a ton of deaths. It could have been far worse. But when the events were relayed back to the Bolshevik leadership, it convinced them that the Legion was causing serious problems and was likely going to actively help the anti-communist groups in Siberia. The result of these concerns was Order 115, sent on May 25, 1918. All Soviets are hereby ordered to disarm the Czechoslovaks immediately. Every armed Czechoslovak found on the railway is to be shot on the spot. Every troop train in which even one armed man is found shall be unloaded, and its soldiers shall be interned in a war prisoners' camp. Local war commissars must proceed at once to carry out this order. Every delay will be considered treason and will bring the offender severe punishment. Now, this order, Order 115, was essentially a declaration of war on the Legion, because there was no scenario in which they trusted the Bolsheviks enough to voluntarily disarm themselves. Because the Legion was so spread out, this order was experienced very differently for each unit. In the east, various Legion units would begin the process of taking over the entire length of the railway to provide safe passage for those behind. Often this meant not just controlling the rails, but also the surrounding areas and the cities. The only problem was that for some of these units, which had units confiscated time and time again on their route eastward, they had very limited usage of weapons. But every time they succeeded in capturing another area, they found more weapons and more supplies, and it made the next easier. They would have to do this over and over again until all the Legion's units were connected together. Their greatest test would be in the tunnels around Lake Baikal in Irkutsk. They had to fight through something like 39 tunnels, and if they failed to take any of them, or if any of them were destroyed by the Bolsheviks, their path east would be blocked for a very long time. Even though there were a few close calls, they managed to successfully take the tunnels, which was kind of the last big obstacle to controlling the route all the way to Vladivostok. Units in the middle of this journey started to man the depots as they passed through them to ensure that they stayed open to the Legion trains that were coming behind. Then furthest west, there were still 10,000 men all the way back in Penza, again, thousands of miles to the west. They were in the greatest danger because Red Army troops were moving in to cut off their movement east. Almost immediately after the order was announced, fighting began in Penza, and within a few days, it was in Legion hands. They started moving Legion trains through as quickly as possible, knowing that time was not on their side. Bolshevik fears of the threat posed by the Czech Legion was not entirely unfounded, it should be said. And in fact, the Legion would control most of the railways east of Penza and also large areas of Siberia during their journey. And they would also work very closely with anti-communist forces that coalesced around Admiral Kolchak in Siberia and other leaders in the areas in between. While the fighting flared up on the entire length of the Trans-Siberian Railway, due to concerns of the Bolsheviks that the Legion were either already against them or soon would be, back in London and Paris, there were plans to essentially use the Legion for that very purpose. Now, the history of Western involvement in the Russian Civil War is a complex topic, but at its simplest level, British, French, and other leaders would have preferred if the Bolsheviks were not in control of Russia, and they would act accordingly. They would first provide material support for the Whites, and later troops would be sent once the First World War started to wind down. They saw the Czech Legion as a possible tool to influence the course of the Civil War as well. This would cause them to draft Joint Note 25 on April 27, 1918. To be clear, that's 1 month before that Order 115 that would cause so many problems. And this Joint Note stated that they preferred, if instead of heading east, those Legion units that were still in central Russia would instead head to ports in northern Russia, and when they arrived, there would be ships to pick them up and take them home. Now, this seems pretty straightforward, but the real intent here was to keep the Legion sort of in play in the Civil War for as long as possible. Once the Legion was out in Siberia, they could not really influence events in the same way that they could in Western Russia. But if they were instead to move north from central Russia and towards the northern ports, they would have to move directly through the Bolshevik-controlled heartland. When news arrived in the Legion units throughout May and June, many of the westernmost units did stop moving. They were told by French liaison officers that ships would be there for them in Archangel, and so they paused and they preferred to move north. There were even some units that would turn around and start moving west again, which was never a popular decision. One of these men, Sergeant Bekvar, would say this: "To have fought and struggled to the east merely to be sent back to the west in the very hour when we thought we had won our purpose was hard, and few of us could prevent feeling an occasional twinge of resentment at our lot. We experienced little enthusiasm for the coming fighting." Now, eventually, this entire plan would fall apart for a whole list of reasons. The three primary ones being that the white forces that the Legion was supposed to work with began to rapidly disintegrate, that the Red Army was becoming massively stronger in terms of its fighting capabilities, and there was also just simply a drop in the desire of the Legion to continue the fight in Russia. Now, while there was all this fighting and political ramifications of the journey and these conversations, the Legion was also traveling thousands of miles across Siberia with nothing but the trains they had and what they could gather on their journey. And author Joan Maguire Moore would describe some of the customizations they made to their trains like this: as many as 40 men slept on board beds stacked side by side, 8 to a bunk. And where the sides of the boxcars met the ceiling, the Legionnaires cut small squares for glass to be fitted in order to let in sunlight. Even in this middle of the summer, Siberian nights could be very cool, and so a second wall was fashioned to partner with the original siding, and the space between was filled with ash and wood shavings to add insulation. End quote. Along with living accommodations, they also had to be self-sufficient in terms of repairs for the trains and the track. They needed medical supplies and food and everything else. In all these efforts, they were greatly aided by the fact that among their number, there was a vast set of experiences from before the war. There were captains and mechanics and factory workers and doctors and countless other specialty trades that could be utilized in efforts to keep the trains moving and the people aboard them alive. The trains essentially became their own rolling cities, and they were kept going through scavenging from the areas that they passed through, as well as, economic transactions with the people who lived around them. They all had things that the Legion needed, and the Legion was able to acquire them. And once their journey through Russia was complete, they would arrive at the port of Vladivostok, where evacuations began on May 29, 1919, and they would continue until September 1920. From there, ships would take them first to Japan, and then across the Pacific to San Francisco. Once in the United States, they boarded trains to send them to New York, but along the way, they would be greeted by groups in all the major cities. The travels of the Legion had been well documented in the American press, with several newspapers having sent correspondents to Russia to chronicle their journey, and so the Legionnaires were famous in some of these cities. And many of those cities also had large Czech and Slovak immigrant communities from before the war, and they made sure to give the Legion members a warm welcome. A welcome so warm that actually many of the Legion members would immigrate to the United States and Canada after their journey. But of course, the goal was to make it back home, and for this they would travel across the Atlantic before a further train journey to the newly created Czechoslovakia. Almost 70,000 men, women, and children would be evacuated from Russia and continue their journey to America, with about 60,000 of that number being members of the Legion, the rest being members of families created along the way, or others who had joined the Legion on their way home. When they arrived back in Eastern Europe, they found a new country created in the aftermath of the First World War, the Czechoslovakia, that many of them had wanted to create. For many members of the Legion, their future lay in positions of authority within the new nation or within the Czechoslovakian army, with their time spent journeying across Russia bringing them fame and a great set of experiences to utilize in their new positions. But most were just happy to be back home after having traveled all the way around the world just to get there. Thank you. I will be looking for questions now. I finished about 30 seconds early. Yeah, I had to cut a lot to get there. Okay. Thank you from Alexander Clifford and Sam Hume, who both have excellent podcasts, History's Most and Pax Britannica, respectively. Yeah, definitely. So, for the most part, the Legion sort of maintained the military structure, right? So when you talk about the units that are moving and the trains and what's happening, a lot of it is commanded by military officers who were leading those units before the journey started, and they really kept that military structure all throughout their journey. Go ahead. There were definitely some. So there was definitely communication sort of among all the groups. I mentioned French liaison officers earlier, and there were these communication points. They did know to some pretty good extent what was happening and what they needed to do. But a lot of times the actual local decisions were made by local groups, local officers leading those groups. And that causes some problems once they start getting involved with the Civil War proper, right? They start working with local groups of anti-communist forces of many varieties. And that causes probably the reputation of the Legion to the Bolsheviks to greatly drop, these actions of these small groups and officers. So yeah, I think I have not seen. The Legion was certainly impactful in sort of post-journey Czechoslovakia, in those first decades of Czechoslovakia. But I do think the upheavals of the Second World War really reduced the influence that the Legion members and sort of the Legion legacy would have on that nation. And I think by the time you start getting into the Czech-Soviet relations, especially after the Second World War, I think a lot of those bad feelings are probably gone, just because so many different people are involved. Okay. Yeah. So I see one. How close did the Legion come to recapturing the Tsar, and was there a plan if they had done so? I don't believe they came very close, and I doubt there was a plan. What you end up seeing with a lot of sort of what happens in especially Eastern Siberia, or not Eastern Siberia, Siberia in general. Siberia is real big. Is that there's not, for unexpected circumstances like that, like there was not an operation to go rescue the Tsar. And part of that is because the whites the people that the Czech Legion was working with were mostly not monarchists. A lot of them weren't fighting for a return of the Tsar. So those anti-communist forces that they were working with, which at times totally outnumbered the Legion, didn't really want the Tsar to return. So they wouldn't have launched an operation specifically to try and get him back. If they had captured him, I'm not really sure what would have happened. I wouldn't be surprised if he would have ended up being sort of turned over to local forces, kind of like Admiral Kolchak, the white leader in Siberia, was. The Legion basically said, we don't want to fight for you. We don't really want to defend you even. So we're just going to hand you to the people who hate you. Good luck. Have fun. See you later, I guess. Okay, the order from the Bolsheviks was pretty extreme and clear-cut. Given that the Czechs made it out, did local Bolshevik forces steer clear of these guys despite the order, or did they just outfight them? I think so. Because of the distances involved and the fact that the Bolsheviks didn't have complete control of these areas, there's a lot of different like little stories you could tell along the way of each of these groups as they interact with the Legion. And I think what you end up seeing is that in a lot of cases, the local sort of militia is probably the right word for a lot of these Bolshevik units, just don't attempt really to fight the Czechs, right? A lot of times they disappear into the countryside. A lot of times they just get out of the way. And I think because the areas that a lot of the areas that the Legion is working through, the core of Bolshevik support was on the rail, right? On these cities near the Trans-Siberian Railway where the Bolsheviks could project their power. And so because they were so isolated, a lot of times what would happen is the Legion would move through, the Bolsheviks would kind of stay out of the way, and then they would get involved with fighting the local whites. Okay. I'm not sure on Cecil's first question. In the historiography, is there a connection made between the Czech Legion and Xenophon's Anabasis? I do not know the answer to that. I'll just throw that out there right now. Did any leaders of the Czech Legion come to leadership positions in interwar Czechoslovak Republic? Yeah. So what I think you definitely see that the members of the Legion are somewhat famous in Czechoslovakia, right? And so there were definitely those that stayed in the military. There were those that continued to be involved in the Czechoslovak military and in the politics of the new nation. And I think that their travels in the Legion certainly made them more popular and easier to have those sort of positions for them. Interesting. So Robert J. Maycock has a story about the city of, I'm so bad with pronunciation, but anyway, a town in the Czech Republic where they have a uniform of one of the Legion. I think that's I'm not at all surprised, and that's definitely interesting. And I think that one of the things, so I'm an American. I live, if you can't tell from my accent, and traveling around Europe the couple times I've been there, the real the local aspect of a lot of the history around events like this is super interesting, right? And so seeing like a little memorial or a little shrine isn't exactly the correct word, but things like that sort of celebrate that history, I'm not at all surprised about. Became a leader post-war. Yeah, I think I can't imagine a better line item to have on your resume or your CV than, hey, I traveled all the way around the world as part of this famous legion of people who just wanted to get back to our little country here. I do talk really fast. I apologize. I try to talk slower. Yeah, I definitely got some poor marks in public speaking in high school because I find it very difficult to talk more slowly. And I actually think part of the problem, this is way off track of the Czech Legion, but I'm going to throw it out there anyway, is that I'm one of those people who listens to podcasts at 1.5 speed. And so for me, just like that's probably distorted my normal like gauge on how fast to talk. It's okay. It's fine. Things have been going great. Yeah, I think it's after you start speeding that up, after you start hitting that plus button on that speed, you can't go back. It's done. Like, yes. Okay. No, that's good. That's real good. Okay. So, funnily enough, there is a period during this journey where Czech currency, so Czech Legion currency, and so that is, so the first groups get to Vladivostok, and they essentially set up a bank, and they provide funds for everybody else who's making the journey. And so what they do is they essentially give units, they give people Czech Legion currency, or like they don't ship bills all the way back to Penza. They kind of have a Czech system, a paper money system that they sort out. And for a while during the Civil War, the Czech Legion currency, or Czech Legion IOUs, were essentially the most solid currency that you could have in Russia, because they were going along this journey. They were trading with local people, local businesses. They needed food, they needed medicine, they needed all these things. And so they were trading with these locals. And so the Czech Legion currency kind of takes over at a point where the sort of the Bolshevik central government based in Western Russia, I keep wanting to mess that up, has a serious economic problems, again, beyond the scope of this, but their money is essentially worthless in areas they don't control. But it's the same for the whites, right? So like Kolchak in Siberia or Denikin in southern Russia, like they also have monetary systems, but again, it's worthless outside of the areas they control. So the Czech Legion's money, as it has this large area where it is kind of an accepted currency, which is, I think, a really interesting fact, and that could happen with this outsider group. Yeah, I think part of the problem is like if you really dive into like the Civil War period and Russian Civil War, like there's so much chaos that there's like there are a lot of different currencies. There's a lot of different groups out there trying to make their own little economies and things that spin up and fall down as often as the leaves, I guess. And so there are probably a lot of things to discuss there. And I think it's probably, I would love to see like a book in general about what I would maybe phrase like chaos economies. Like, what does the economies look like in Russia when it descends into civil war and everything falls apart? Or like the Spanish Civil War, which we were talking about earlier. There's some stuff about that, but more looking at those kinds of things. I think it's really interesting. Yeah, and like the Bolshevik economic policies are the whole talk in themselves, based on how they kind of evolve and grow and change over just a couple years of the Revolution and Civil War periods. Personal question. Yeah, I'll field it. So for those who don't know, I have a 8-week-old baby at this point, 9-week-old baby, doing fantastic. She smiles. She has fun in her diaper, occasionally. That's how it goes. Yeah, yes. Yeah, it's kids are great, but boy, they are certainly a lot of work in there. I have no ability to in any way care for myself in even the smallest of things. Mm-hmm. I have not. I have not. I also have a 4-year-old, and she knows that Daddy does podcasts, but that's about as much as she knows. History's most talk about. I am always open to coming on other podcasts to talk about anything. One of the I always getting off the history thing back onto podcasting a little bit. With podcasting or my podcasting being such a single person effort, I end up thinking a lot about history, talking into this microphone about history, and that's about it. So I always love talking to other people about history, for sure. And I think foreign intervention in the Russian Civil War is a absolutely fascinating topic because of how it is portrayed by the various sides in the Civil War. So the Bolsheviks, the communists have a specific sort of message about that intervention. The Western powers have things they like to talk about and things they don't like to talk about what the whites are doing, and the various atrocities they are committing, maybe would probably be a good way to describe it. And then the whites, who are kind of stuck in the middle, like to complain a little bit about what help is provided. Meanwhile, the communists are like, look, everybody's invading us. Come help us from the foreign invaders. So I think it's definitely an interesting topic. Yeah. So I think, you have the standard stories of soldiers and drinks, for sure. I have not heard any sort of like larger stories, or even necessarily a lot of larger issues with their actions. Like a unit getting wasted and doing bad things, I guess. So I don't think so. Nothing beyond the what you would expect from soldiers traveling together in trains, and so that kind of stuff. Yeah, I think the big thing for me was, I think, so I've been talking a lot about military history for years now on my various podcasts, and one of the things that really surprised me about the Legion story, specifically in the Civil War as a whole, is how impactful very small groups of very dedicated people can be in scenarios like the Russian Civil War, where it's one of the biggest problems that all the various sides have is sort of marshaling and aiming resources in a specific direction because of the disorganization around them. And so you have small units, the Czech Legion, you're talking, 60,000 people spread out over thousands of miles. You're talking maybe hundreds, maybe 1,000, maybe a couple thousand people together at one time, but they can have this incredible impact on events because they're motivated, they're organized, and they all want the same thing. And I think it's really interesting to see those types of stories being told. Mhm. Yeah, so I have some additional reading here on the screen. I also have a source list for this talk I have the URL there at the bottom. And of course, hit me up on Twitter if you have any questions. I'm going to be, I think, moving to another room, right? There's a meeting room I will be hanging out in for questions. Of course, questions about anything. Yeah, thank you for moderating this panel and for volunteering to be a moderator. Have a wonderful day, everyone.